I'm joined by two pinball enthusiasts today. Couldn't be happier. Tim Stevens, freelance journalist. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Tom. Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
And Ron Richards, not only co-founder of Scorbit, but also co-host of Android Faithful, right here in the DTNS family of podcasts. Ron, thanks for talking to us, man.
Happy to be here, as always.
Yeah.
Love talking pinball. So.
I have had this note on my reminders for months. I think ever since, Tim, your Ars Technica article came out, that I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to get these two together and just talk about pinball tech. So thanks for doing this. Let's start with the reverse engineering, the game preservation that you do, Tim. I think a lot of people don't understand what needs to happen. They probably think, well, you just get a screwdriver and you tighten some things up. Like, talk a little bit about what goes into getting a game and preserving it.
Yeah, if you've never looked inside of a pinball machine, I highly recommend you look up some videos online to see what's going on in there, because it's a pretty wild scene. The older machines before the 70s were electromechanical, a lot of moving cogs and circuits that changed the game logic. And then as you move into the 80s and 90s, they're still wildly complicated. And even modern machines today, the circuitry has gotten smaller, but still you're looking at a massive tangle of wires going on in there. And of course, I think one of the challenges with these machines is that they were really only designed to last or to live in the wild for a year or two at most. They were basically disposable. And so for some of those of us who want to keep these older machines running, a machine that was only supposed to last a year and is now 40 or 50 years old, those components are no longer available. So we've got breakable things like things on the playfield, plastics, things like that, which ultimately, thankfully, are being reproduced, and those you kind of can't do at home. But we're seeing a really growing segment in the industry of people who are reverse engineering even the PCBs, the circuit boards that control some of these machines, because all the schematics are out there. The manuals that these machines all came with were designed so that people could really kind of tear them apart and rebuild them if they want to. So there's a kind of cottage industry, almost, I guess you could say, of kind of taking these machines, breaking them down to their bare bits, and then being able to rebuild them. So, for example, I'm restoring a Comet pinball machine, which I think was from 1984, 1985. And the PCB, the thing that really controls the logic of how the game works, was completely shot because the batteries that run the thing leaked and they destroyed the board. And of course, you can't buy a 40-some-year-old pinball machine PCB anymore. But a gentleman on the Pinside Forum, which is kind of the largest place for pinball nerds to hang out, reverse engineered the circuit board and produced a new, basically the original thing, but with using additional and some other niceties that are built into that as well. And I basically bought this raw piece from him, went to a bunch of different places online, bought a bunch of kind of dated old components and soldered them all in there. And lo and behold, it worked, and it worked better than it did to begin with. So the idea of taking this incredibly complicated thing and reverse engineering it, but producing it forward now and improving it is kind of, I don't know, it feels unique to the pinball industry to me, the idea that you can do that. And I think it's pretty fun. And for me, it's been a great learning experience. We've only been restoring pinball machines for about 4 or 5 years now. And I've learned so much about electronics, about soldering, about everything else. And it's been a really fun journey.
Yeah, the community itself, as you mentioned, Tim, just like the self-sustaining of the hobby within the community is one of the things that I love about it. I first started playing, competitive pinball around like 2010, 2011, and I would go to these bigger tournaments like Pinburg, which is a big tournament that happened in Pittsburgh that is now back. And there's another big tournament called Indisc in Southern California that I just went to in late January in Riverside, California. And these tournaments have all games from like games that came out last year to games that came out in the 60s, right? And when you've got hundreds of people playing the same pinball machines in a small period of time, they're bound to break because, Tim, as you mentioned, a lot of them are mechanical. There's physical parts to it. The more modern machines have circuit boards and PCBs and modern CPUs and things like that, and memory and RAM and VRAM. But they've also got solenoids and actuators and the flippers and rubber bands, and everything can break. And there's this stunning community of people who have kept it alive by either, sourcing and manufacturing parts that are expired, because majority of these companies are gone. They don't exist anymore. They went out of business. And so a pipeline of parts, there are distributors like Marco and Pinball Life and other companies out there who are keeping the dream alive by making the parts. But then there are other people who are taking that opportunity to upgrade them and redo boards. So for example, there's a board called a Weebly board, which is basically the processing board that can replace in a 1970s or 1980s solid state pinball machine. You could pull out the old one if it dies and put this new one in, and it's got better connections. It's got, more recent soldering. It's basically will extend the life of the pinball machine, which is just awesome to see. So. Are
there fewer issues with pinball than there are with video games regarding intellectual property, because there's just a lot of abandonware? What's the landscape like there?
It's mixed. There's some stuff that is abandonware that nobody's really looking to. What's great about it is the majority of people are hobbyists and they're not looking truly to profit from it. There are some extended patents or copyrights that while the company went out of business, someone bought them. So for example, all the classic late 80s, 1990s Williams Bally games, which are some of the best games that ever came out. Tom, I'm sure you played one at some point in arcade, whether it's Funhouse or Medieval Madness or something like that. Someone bought all those copyrights when Williams went out of business. And so if you wanted to, there are companies that are remaking the older games. For example, Chicago Gaming Company is redoing Cactus Canyon and Attack from Mars and Medieval Madness, some classics. Pedretti Pinball out of Italy has made a new round of Funhouse. They've all licensed the artwork and the material and the schematics and things like that in order to do an official release. But the hobbyists that are out there also, if someone has an old machine and they're looking to, they need to replace the soundboard, that stuff kind of happens, I don't say in the gray market, but in the space of, it's not, commercially viable in that regard.
One of the nice things is that a lot of the most breakable components are kind of standardized, even as you go back decades. A lot of the posts and the plastics and things like that. There are certainly a lot of specialized parts, but there's also a lot of stuff that is really shared across generations of machines as well. So if you break one of the little red posts on the pinball machine, it's probably the same post that was used 40, 50 years ago as well. So those things are, definitely not any kind of coverage, any kind of copyright or trademark, anything like that. Those are relatively easy to get. But yeah, it's really when you get into the circuit boards, the control wheels, and the individual artwork that things can get a little bit more complicated, especially the play fields, which is the wooden surface that the game actually happens on. When those start to wear out, there are ways of replacing them, but that's a huge job, and finding those can be challenging depending upon what kind of game you're talking about.
Yeah. And then when there's more specific, unique aspects. So, for example, I own a 1994 Data East Guns N' Roses pinball machine, and the person who I bought that from, I bought it used, obviously. The person who I bought it from changed the gun that is used for the shooter lane. It was originally a six-shooter revolver, kind of like the Guns N' Roses logo. Whoever owned it at some point in the past, I swapped it to a 9mm style gun.
Okay.
And so now, Tim, we're probably similar. I want to have it to be in its original form. No one is making that gun part anymore. And the only way I can replace it is to either find another Guns N' Roses machine that is so destroyed beyond its value that I can strip it for parts, or find someone who's willing to part with theirs. Either way, I posted on Pinside, which is a very popular forum, as Tim mentioned. I posted, I'm like, looking to buy a gun, and the first response was LOL, good luck. So so like while some stuff is replaceable and some stuff is reproducible, some stuff is lost to the years. So.
And that's part of the joy of keeping these machines alive. My wife and I look for, abused, beaten machines, like you said, Ron. Things are in really rough shape, and try to bring them back to life. And it's a game of knowing how far is too far gone. There are certain components that if they're missing, it's fine. It's no big deal. There are other components that if they're missing, you're in a lot of trouble. So, that's part of the joys of keeping these machines alive.
Yeah, and at least for me, part of it has been understanding how the older machines work and understanding how they work and how they're passing data, because what we do at Scorbit is basically, we're our mission is to, connect pinball machines to the internet. That's basically the one liner of what we do. And when you've got a machine from 1981, that's a solid state machine where the internet was just a concept back then, understanding how the machines work is the first step in order to do that. So.
Let's talk about bringing pinball games into the present and even the future. I know there's a lot of what I might call video gamification of pinball, right? Yep. Pinball, I think in a lot of people's minds is you stand there, you play the game, maybe you get a high score up on the LED screen, and you're done, right? What are some of the things, Ron, that you're doing to bring that more into the internet age?
Well, yeah, and that was really what the whole kind of premise was, is that initially when, myself and my co-founder, Jay Adelson over at Scorbit were dreaming it up back in 2015, I initially had the idea of I'm really tired of writing down my high scores. Wouldn't it be cool if there was an app to keep track of it? And then, Jay kind of pushed it one further and goes, yeah, that's fine. But, anybody can make an app. Wouldn't it be cooler if we could, build a device that went in the pinball machines to actually connect them, and then we can extract all other sorts of data that we can, from there to see what's going on there. And that's really when we're like, oh God, that'd be so cool. And it took us a whole bunch of years, but we did it. We reverse engineered a bunch of machines. We understood how every machine from every era worked, from the solid states all the way up into, today, and to figure out how we could extract that data. And once we did that, not only are you able to extract scores, which allow you to keep track of your own personal high scores. We plug into pinball tournament software to make sure that the scorekeeping is accurate and things like that. But then it said, oh, wait a minute, we can do a lot more here, in that we can create a layer of achievements on top of an old game. So you can have a game like Medieval Madness that came out in 1995. The code is finished, the company is out of business, the game is what it is, and anybody who's played pinball a lot has played it to the wizard mode, and then at that point you think you're done with the machine. But wouldn't it be great if you could create targets and create quests and create games within the game by using that connection? And that's really what we're doing. And it's been great to see what we're doing at Scorbit validated by the largest current pinball manufacturer, Stern, who has a system called Insider Connected, where they're basically doing that on games that are shipping today. So all of their new games come out connected. They built the game rules and things like that. But then on top of that, they've created achievements and targets and quests and things like that to pursue. And so really what you've got is this whole world of giving a pinball machine a new life, so to speak. The newer games, it's just like another thing, another feature. But for what really gets me excited is, so Tim, on Comet, we can create a whole bunch of new goals that you can, layer into while you're playing Comet. So you're not just going for the score, you're going for how many times do you hit that right ramp, or how many times do you, get that spinner, or whatever it might be. So.
Yeah, it's great, because if you are only used to playing modern pinball machines and you're used to really complex modes and cycling from one to the next and quests and things within the game, which manufacturers have added over the past 5 or 10 years. But if you go back to the earlier machines, there's really none of that. It is basically 3 balls and you're out, and there's not a lot of saving state even from one ball to the next. And in a lot of games of even through the mid 80s, if you had 2 balls locked for a multi-ball and the second player comes in and triggers multi-ball, they get your multi-ball. So it wasn't even shared from one player to the next. But now we see machines like we have the new Dungeons and Dragons machine coming out from Stern this year, which has persistent characters. So you can basically level up your character in the game as you go from one game to the next and unlock new features and that kind of thing. It's really been an interesting evolution. If you do get to go to one of those shows like Ron mentioned, or there are quite a few places out there that have collections of pinball machines that date back over different generations. On the East Coast, for example, there's the Electromagnetic Museum in Rhode Island, or there's a place called Pastime Pinball in Manchester, or Sanctum in Connecticut. I'm sure there's a ton in the West Coast as well.
Silver Ball in Asbury Park, New Jersey. The Pacific Pinball Museum in Alameda actually is one of the best collections on the West Coast that people want to check out.
If you get to go to one of those, I highly recommend you pick a table from the 60s, then step up to the 70s and 80s, and see the evolution as the games become more and more complicated. And the earlier games are slower, but they're really hard, and they tend to get a little bit more momentum and a little bit more flow as you go into the 80s, and then as you go into the 90s and into the modern day machines, that's when you start to see this layering on of different modes and different gameplay challenges, really to kind of cater to a younger audience who are more used to playing video games, who are more used to moving up from one thing to the next. And it's really great, Ron, that we can bring that to the older machines as well, because I think a lot of modern gamers, they play a game like Comet and think, oh, this is kind of lame and boring, I want to go back to Godzilla.
Well, yeah, exactly. And then another piece, at least what we're trying to do at Scorbit, is we're trying to promote play. And so what we've added also is the ability of a concept of challenges or head-to-head play. So I could step up to a Comet, get a great score, and then challenge you, Tim, saying, hey, can you beat this score? And it becomes kind of a great way to take what was a single player game or a a multiplayer game only if you're all 4 of you are physically there, into a head-to-head game with anybody in the world who has access to that same game.
If he were to put Scorbit on Comet, how does that work?
So basically, how it's real simple. We have a device called the Scorbitron, which, I did not name after myself. I just was trying to
Scorbit Ron.
Yeah, I know. That really reminds me of that. But
Totally
I just like
fair.
the idea of like the 1950s, like the Magnetron, like that sort of thing. Yeah. Anyway, but so we have a device called the Scorbitron, which is basically what we invented coming off of that idea that Jay and I had years ago, which was it's a single circuit board that goes into in pinball machine, and then we've developed a series of connectors for the different types of pinball machines. So for Comet, there would be a specific type of connector, which is different than a more modern games connector, that sort of thing. And what happens is that as the data is flowing around inside the pinball machine, we kind of siphon it off and then send it up to our cloud platform that we built in our infrastructure, where we absorb all that data, and then we send it back down to the mobile app to the user in order to use it. And so, it takes maybe 5 minutes to install. Maybe you just gotta, plug it into power. There's a whole bunch, as Tim, as you probably know, a whole bunch of sources of power in a pinball machine. Imagine like the inside of a computer with the motherboard, you got those white, those white power cables. You can siphon off those power cables.
Some are more dangerous than others.
Exactly. Yeah, please be careful. We have very explicit instructions to show you what to do. And then you plug in a cable within the machine to our device, and that's what gets the data, and that's how it works. It's pretty simple. And for the more modern machines, we work with a lot of manufacturers, and they are able to bypass our device completely. We're working with them on the software level so that their code incorporates our SDK and sends the data up to our cloud service without a device even all you need is internet connection. So.
Now, I know a lot of people probably want to go play pinball games now after hearing you guys talk about this, but they can't, right? They don't have one. Maybe they're far from one of these museums. They're not going to be traveling. And you guys were telling me a little bit about the virtual pinball scene that you can get into just from your computer. My first impression was like, oh, but the pinball purists must not like that. But it sounds like everybody's like, no, that's a great entry point.
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
Yeah,
for sure. Opinions are mixed for sure. I think in general, everyone agrees that they can be a really great way to learn some of these more complicated games, because a modern game like Godzilla, like D&D, there's a ton of different things going on and different modes that you need to unlock. And if you're doing that at 75 cents or $1 a pop, you're never really going to figure that game out. So, but ultimately, like you said, Tom, a lot of these games are just really hard to find, and a lot of them are, it's just impractical. And so, if you want to experience a given game, it's a great way to do it. But the scene it's semi-underground, semi-supported. There are certainly some licensed games that are available through various pinball emulators. A lot of them are a little bit more like kind of the ROM scene in video games, where it's kind of maybe semi-legal, but just because no one's actually actively suing them. Certainly, there are a lot of different ways to do it, starting at the basics of running an emulator on your computer and playing things that way, all the way up to you can buy full-on virtual pinball machines that basically have a big vertically oriented display instead of the actual play field, and it's actually in a full pinball cabinet. And some of them even have haptics in there to make it feel a little bit more like you're playing pinball. I think for me, the joy of playing pinball is the mechanical action, the fact that nothing ever reacts the same way. But for sure, it is a luxury to have one of these tables at home, or machine, excuse me, I keep saying table, and I know that that's definitely not a good thing to say. To have a machine like that at home is a luxury item for sure. And so I think that, I think everyone needs to be somewhat accepting of the fact that not everyone can do that. But there are certainly a number of curmudgeons out there who would say that it's blasphemy to ever play a virtual pinball machine.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because Tim, you mentioned, because like how I learned a lot of the rules for the games of the 80s and 90s were on like the Pinball Arcade app, right? Which is a licensed, you can download it in for your tablet or iPad or whatever it might be, and it's got kind of ported over versions of those classic games, and they've really done a great job of getting the physics down. So you can like a big thing in pinball is called nudging, where you actually physically move the machine to move the ball, and it's not perfect, but they do emulate that by you kind of put a little pressure on the accelerometer and it nudges the machine and that sort of thing. But it has been a great way to learn, but it doesn't replace the haptic in-person feeling of the mechanics and the physics of a pinball machine. But in working at Scorbit, what we found was fascinating was the underground virtual pinball community, or VPins as they called, which Tim, as you mentioned, was more on the unlicensed, kind of ROM side of things, is just fascinating because not only are they, as you mentioned, Tim, they're you're able to create a pinball machine with displays in a wood box, and simulate the whole experience of being in a pinball, of having a pinball machine, but with a computer and monitors, kind of driving it. And that way, instead of spending $10,000 to have one pinball machine, you can spend a few $1,000s and have every pinball machine, right? So I see the attractiveness for somebody who's, kind of amateur, or, is curious about it, or just wants it to augment their, kind of their home arcade or game room. But what's fascinating about the folks in the VPin community is that at least from my research, they outnumber the physical pinball players by a lot these days because there's no barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And they've really taken it upon themselves not only to port over the old classic games that we all love and improve the physics and make the best version possible, but they're creating new games. So for example, there's a SpongeBob virtual pinball game out there that someone created that is like a huge hit in the VPin community. It's not licensed. Please, Nickelodeon, don't go after them. They're very cool. But like it's one of the biggest hits in the VPin community, and it's completely grassroots. It's completely, these folks are just tackling it, and it's another way of expressing a love for for this type of game, which I love to see personally. And Scorbit does work with VPins. We were able to connect that so people can keep track of their scores on virtual pinball. Nice. because they asked us for it. And that was what was so cool, is that they're like, hey, somebody came to us and they said, can I implement your guys' SDK in my virtual pinball? And we're like, sure. And then next thing you know, we saw an influx of users coming from it. And it's just really cool to see. And neither one is exactly the same as the other, and they both have their pros and cons. And ultimately, it's whatever makes you happy as long as you're playing pinball.
And there's also an interesting hybrid approach that's developing. There's a company called Multimorphic that's released a pinball machine called the P3, which is basically, it's kind of like one of these virtual pinball machines, but it's actually built within the playfield of a pinball machine. And then you can basically buy add-on games that change the upper playfield. So you basically get half of a different pinball machine with each new game that you buy. So you have one cabinet which is persistent, but then you can buy different games that you can play on that cabinet with some kind of relatively minor modifications as you go from one to the next. You couldn't do, 1 minute play one thing and the next minute play another, but with, a half an hour or an hour worth of work, you can convert from one game to another, which, saves a lot of floor space and a lot of money as well. They've got licensed titles. They just did a Princess Bride. They've got one that's a Weird Al theme. And it's kind of an interesting way. If you've only got room for one machine, if you don't want to be dropping, 10 grand each on these things, you can buy one machine and then kind of cycle through as you get bored with one thing. So it's an interesting hybrid approach, trying to bring the digital and the physical play of pinball together into one happy medium.
Well, thank you both for increasing my knowledge of pinball by like 2,000% just now.
It really is I was at Indisc. When I was at Indisc last month, someone asked me, they said, do you think that, the majority of pinball players are tech people because of the technology from it? And what's fascinating is that on one hand, yes, a lot of us that come from tech are fascinated by this stuff. We want to get our hands dirty. We want to get in it. But what's so great about pinball, the pinball community, is that as many people that I've met through pinball that are into tech, I've met mechanics and nurses and social workers and teachers. And it is truly an American, available to anyone type of hobby. And yes, there's a portion of us tech nerds who love it because we want to take it apart and figure out how it works and rebuild it. But there's so many other people who just want to play the game and have fun. So.
Well, Tim Stevens, if folks want to follow more of what you do beyond just pinball, where should they go?
I'm timstevens.substack.com. If you want to check out my newsletter, I'm Tim Stevens on most platforms, including YouTube. In fact, I've got a video of the rebuild that we did of that Comet pinball machine, which is for sale, by the way, if anybody's interested. You can check that out on YouTube. And I'm in various social platforms as they arise and as they fall.
Yes, indeed, as they do more and more often these days. That's Tim Stevens with a V, by the way,
yes,
if anybody needs to know. Ron, where can folks find more about Scorbit and everything else you do?
Yeah, so just go to scorbit.io. That's our website, and there you can find links and information about our the Scorbitron device and links to download our mobile app. And we're on social media. Either most often it's at Scorbit Pinball, like on Instagram and things like that. And then for me, I'm at RonXO across the universe of social media. And then every Tuesday you can find me here on the Daily Tech News Show, YouTube and Twitch channels, doing Android Faithful, talking about the world of smartphones and mobile devices and fun stuff with the crew over there.
Fantastic. Go do that as well. Thanks you both for chatting with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.